In China, we're very interested in this kind of election because China has election but doesn't have general election. Okay, so and then my personal experiences, I used to believe in election. I think it's fair. But then you look at what happened in Taiwan. Taiwan is very interesting to China, mainland China, is because it's almost like experimental, because it's the Chinese living there, right? It's a smaller, much smaller scale. It's like a smaller China. So you test that to see how it works. Well, I'm not impressed by the leaders they chose. Like the current one, Tsai Ing-wen, in China, in mainland, we call her Zelensky. He's like he's almost like going to turn Taiwan into another Ukraine, which would most definitely hurt the people living in Taiwan, right? I mean, forget about the mainland. Of course, if there's a war, mainland China will suffer too. But just that little island, the war will be in that island, right? And she doesn't seem so interested in that aspect at all. She just go with whatever the United States asked her to do, and totally ignore the real needs. What's the benefit, right? For a while, right now, I don't know if they solved that problem. They don't even have eggs. And the reason they don't have eggs is, I mean, there's a crisis of eggs. The reason is they don't want to buy eggs from mainland China, which is right there. They have to buy it from Thailand, from even Australia, expensive eggs. That's insane, right? It's just so ideological driven that she's not really working for the people at all. But she's elected. You see, that's where, I'm always very ambivalent. I have lots of reservations about election in general. That has been my view about these things.
Elections can only function, as we discussed, if there is open debate and proper discussion. And from the sound of it, there isn't open debate and proper discussion in Taiwan anymore. And I am sure that is the case, because how can there be, given that the United States, to be absolutely straightforward about this, does not want to see a proper reunification of the Chinese nation. I mean, it's opposed to it, and it is the dominant power in Taiwan. I mean, it basically runs Taiwan. I mean, talking about Taiwanese sovereignty, as some people pretend, there is no such thing. There is no such thing in Taiwan, nor can there be. I mean, that is talking about Taiwanese sovereignty is an absurdity. What there is in Taiwan is a situation where the United States basically controls the political landscape, controls the political debate, promotes particular political leaders, controls the internal discussion, and is able to use this enormous influence that it has within the country to ensure that particular leaders rise and pursue policies that are favorable to the United States and follow the interests of the United States. Ukraine is not that different. I mean, let's take the example of Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky was elected on an anti-war platform. He spoke about improving relations with Russia, achieving reconciliation with the Russians. When the moment he was elected, it was clear that wasn't his agenda at all. He was basically put up to say that because there were lots of people in Ukraine who wanted to hear that policy to be followed. But of course, the moment he was there, he adopted a completely different policy. And what we see in Taiwan is more of the same. There's going to be, as there were local elections, I understand, in Taiwan, and the Kuomintang did very well. But the fact is that you can have elections in Ukraine. They don't mean anything if they go against the wishes of those who have the real control. And I'm sure the same is true in Taiwan today. I think people in China need to understand, and my overwhelming sense about this is that they do understand, that there is no Taiwanese problem. There is no problem of Taiwan. It is a problem between China and the United States, and that is all.
Yes, definitively. Yes. Yeah. Just like Ukraine, right? It's the problem between Russia and the US more so than anything else. Yeah, definitely. Great. So these are the main questions I prepared. So do you have anything you want to ask me?
Well, I would ask what the general mood is in China at the moment. And I'll tell you why I ask this, because, a couple of years ago, relations with China, between China and the West, the United States, well, they were never entirely easy.
Yeah.
Because the Americans always, I think, felt that China was just a bit too big
Yeah.
to control.
Yeah.
And perhaps they didn't completely understand China. And I think at some level they sensed that. But now we have a situation where the United States is becoming it's becoming very hostile to China, and is talking about China in the most extraordinary way and most frightening way about this.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, are Chinese people aware of this? How do they feel about this? Are they nervous? Are they angry? Are they prepared for the challenge which is to come?
Yeah.
Because I have no doubt that there is going to be a major challenge. I mean, there's going to be some kind of a showdown between China and the United States, because it's clear to me that the political class in Washington, instead of recognizing, every country has its great moment when the world power, and then things move on, the world changes. But what it's changing to is a new system where there's many centers of power, and China is one, and China's rise is something to be embraced. They see it instead as a challenge, and they see it as a threat to themselves, and they're all united around this, and they're going to try and hammer it down. I mean, what is the mood in China in response to all of this? I'm not talking about the leadership amongst people.
Well, what you just said is, I think, all of those. I mean, China is big, right? So there are different factions within the China. I think the overwhelming feeling I feel is people are still quite puzzled by this attitude change from the United States and the Western, in general. Like, it's not that long ago, the two countries had a lot of businesses. I mean, there is always ups and downs and small frictions here and there. That's not unusual. But just like all of a sudden, like 180-degree, that you are our threat, our enemy, that kind of mentality. I think lots of Chinese still don't quite understand why. Why is it that you see us like a threat? Yes, China does, the living standard is going up, but people do feel it, that people feel like China is getting stronger. Well, but who doesn't want to be strong, right? It's kind of only natural that you want to build up your country, you have better living standard, long life expectancy, happier life in general. I mean, it seems like very basic things that China is doing, right, to just basically improve everybody's living, right? Now, why is that an issue for the United States, for the West? Why is the West feel so threatened by the rise of China? You see, that's, I think, lots of people still don't understand. And then there are, of course, people who much more hawkish, if you can say, is that, okay, I don't care if you why you feel that way. You feel, I'm an enemy. Well, then I am your enemy, I guess. Then let's just pick up a fight, etc. And then also there are lots of people feel like I think you and Alex was talking about yesterday that the Kremlin spokesperson, right, that he's too soft sometimes. I think the same issue. There are lots of people in China feel like the foreign ministry is too soft. Even though the West characterized the current foreign ministry as some kind of wolf warrior or something, they use that word. Lots of people like, why is that called a wolf warrior? What's wolf about it, right? They just a little bit more assertive, more clear about China's position. Like the ambassador's interview that we talked before, right? The French, the China ambassador to France. I mean, the East and the West, the China and the Europe has totally different view on that. The Europeans are like, oh, how could he say, those things and blah, blah. In China, people see that it's like, well, what he said is simply true. He just stated the truth. What's wrong with that? Why do you call him like a wolf warrior? What's wolf about that? So it's almost like if I were there, I would punch the guy, the interview. So
absolutely.
So it's just like, I think there's a disconnection about what is going on in the West. Why do they feel so threatened by China? So that's, I think, the overwhelming feelings in China.
Interesting. I mean, just to say on the wolf warrior thing, I mean, the West has always given itself the right to be as rude and abusive to other people and as insulting as it wants. I mean, you know, the things that Western leaders routinely say about others, it's just astonishing. But, you know, if anybody has the effrontery to answer back, well, that's outrageous, you can't talk to us like that. So, I mean, you know, Biden can interrupt his State of the Union address by saying something extraordinarily, unnecessarily insulting about China's president. And that's apparently fine. Everybody gives him a standing ovation when he says it. But if, you know, in China, somebody says something about Biden, well, that's outrageous. That's an act of what the French call lèse-majesté. It's insulting the king, which is, you know, you can't do that. And I think the whole wolf warrior thing is just a piece of myth. I mean, I've been reading Chinese statements now for some time. I haven't noticed any change. I think Chinese officials talk today as they talked yesterday, as they talked the day before. It's just that sometimes now, because the West has become so rude and aggressive about China, they have to respond. But that otherwise is you can't just sit back and let your country be talked about in that fashion. But the moment you respond, well, then you become a wolf warrior. It's something, again, that Chinese people should not be fooled about. I've seen it again many times. I'll be very interested to see how this goes. But I think Chinese people, I can understand why they are puzzled. The thing always to understand, and one of the reasons I've mentioned to you before, my attraction to Chinese painting is the Chinese nation has always, it seems to me, been profoundly peaceful. And when you take an interest in Chinese art and culture, that is very obvious. Whereas Western societies are very hardwired to conceive of everything in terms of questions of power. And that's a fundamental difference. And I'm afraid the quest for power can beget violence. You see that in Western culture. And I think the Chinese people need to be ready for this. They need to be ready for the fact that it's not a question of whether China is rich or poor. The fact that China is powerful, or more powerful potentially than America, that is for America, for the West, an impossible challenge.
Yeah, I also noticed that, like, throughout the Chinese history, when you describe a certain emperor, if you say this is a good emperor, we use the word 安居乐业, meaning actually peaceful. You know, everybody living a good life, peaceful, happy life. That's how you measure if an emperor is doing well. Whereas in the West, it's more like just Obama. I believe in his book, he said or somebody interviewed him, and he said something like he's thinking if he should be a war president, right? So it seems like because Lincoln was a war president. So the greatness lays if you have win a war, a major war of some sort, some kind of. Seems like that's how you validate yourself, being a leader, right? So that's very different, I think.
It's profoundly different. And it's interesting you brought up the example of Lincoln, because of course Lincoln himself had to lead his country through a great civil war, which was probably unavoidable. But he wasn't somebody who actually liked war or reveled in it. And of course, almost his very last words in his second inaugural address to the American people was that America should seek a just and lasting peace between itself and all nations. That's, I think, the lesson Americans need to learn. And the tragedy is that those words of Lincoln are always forgotten. And instead, we go for the warrior.
I mean, Obama only remembers Lincoln lead a war. It seems like he didn't listen to those words.
He certainly didn't listen to those words. And of course, you mentioned Churchill. The cult of Churchill in Britain is very connected to the fact that he was a war leader and things of that kind. And this is a very difficult thing, and it's a fundamental difference between perception between China and the West. You could see it in Chinese literature as well. I mean, when Chinese literature is about war, it's about internal conflict within China and the means to find resolution to it. Whereas in the case of the West, it's usually wars of conquest and things of that kind. So it's a very great, very profound difference between the West and China, which is perhaps one that, as I said, Chinese people need to be ready for.
Yeah. It's so interesting, you know, because I lived many years in the United States. I observed the political class here, and then, you know, compare with my heritage, you know, inheritance, you know, from China. So yeah, I see what you're saying, and you summarize it so well. So this is great.